Hey there. Somehow my video got cut off last night while I was recording lecture, and so I didn't discover it till the very end, so I was really upset. But I'm going to continue with the lecture this morning and with a wardrobe change. And so let's continue with cultural adaptation under the Castro et al. 2004 article. And so basically, they define cultural adaptation as basically making modifications to a program so that it's culturally sensitive and tailored to a cultural group's traditional worldviews, right, to their beliefs, to their values, their norms. Um, and so one way to adapt a program is to identify sources of mismatch between the original validation group of the model program or the evidence-based intervention, um, and between the new consumer group, right? So we know that there might be mismatches between the original group, which is typically and in many instances non-Hispanic white. Um, most interventions that have demonstrated some kind of efficacy are validated with groups that are largely non-Hispanic white, with maybe a small representation of other racial ethnic minorities. And so basically these sources of mismatch really need to be identified early on and addressed within the program before implementing an evidence-based program with a new intervention group. So it should consist more of than just surface, modifications or adaptations. And by surface, we mean like you could take an entire program and simply translate it to a different language. That would be a bit of a surface type of adaptation, even though now it's available in the language of the target population. Um, there might still be areas of mismatch, even if it was translated. Was it appropriately translated for the regional population? Does it match their unique language and dialect in that region? You can potentially adjust role models. So if we're working with African Americans, we decide that we're going to incorporate an African American role model in whatever video or PSA we're creating, if that's our target population. And these things are important. We're not saying they're not important because this is what people see, right, and hear. That they're more evident in terms of adaptations. But if you're ignoring the target population's worldview and not addressing those things within the program, you're gonna lose. You're gonna lose. You're not gonna be able to either engage participants, or if you do manage to engage them, you won't be able to retain them in the program. And so the adaptation should consist of more than just these surface types of adaptations, these superficial or yeah, not just on the surface, but a deep adaptation so that we're addressing the population's beliefs, norms, and values, and any other relevant conditions of that population for the particular behavior or lifestyle. And so this, again, does require some cultural competence on behalf of the developers and adapters, and even among the program delivery staff, as we just discussed at the end of the last video. So basically, I mean, the big overall goal is to produce a culturally equivalent version of the model program, right, for your new consumer group. I know. Okay. I want to make sure I don't turn off my video by accident again. Okay. So the Castro article talked about 12-step approach developed by Becker et al. For kind of tailoring an evidence-based intervention. You should know that there are many, many models and frameworks for culturally adapting a program. They involve steps, but I don't think many researchers know what to do with the steps. So it's like, okay, step one, get to know your target population. It's like, okay, how do I do that? How do I get my foot in the door with the target population, right? Maybe they need more how-tos in these frameworks or 12-step approaches to adapting an intervention. And so we get a little bit of that, the how-to, right, adapt your program with the article that was looking to affect risk behaviors or substance abuse behaviors among African American adolescents. Okay, so just some short points regarding these frameworks, like this one by Becker, is that it takes time to culturally adapt. I think somebody in their weekly questions asked, well, just how long does it take to culturally adapt the program? And it depends how different the new consumer group is from the original validation group, right? It's like, how different. If you're adapting a program for another subgroup of non-Hispanic white that maybe have a slightly different culture, maybe it'll take a little bit less time, right? If there's no involvement of translation, if there's no huge differences between the groups, you might get away. But the only way you'll know that is by interacting with the population, engaging the population to make sure that the program is a good fit for them. Okay. So program evaluation, program adaptations, are dynamic. So we see that, we might make an initial attempt to culturally adapt a program and even kind of test, go and present it back to the community for feedback once we adapt the program. But once you finally implement it, you continue to learn about what additional things need to be adapted. And so you can continue making adjustments. And so that's why we have pilot studies when we're first testing out these interventions with a new consumer group. And we often ask for feedback from participants in the pilot study to say, what worked for you, what didn't work for you. And you saw that in the article that was trying to promote weight loss in Native Americans, right? They did several iterations of their intervention so they could continue adapting it for the new consumer group. So the adaptation may continue to evolve over time, right? You might continue making additional adjustments and refinements to the intervention. And so this particular one has a logic model that kind of helps protect the original model programs or the evidence-based interventions, therapeutic components, right? Or the theory-based components of the intervention. That's what you want to protect. Those things are likely universal in human behavior, but the way they're structured for a particular population has to be based on the values and norms of that particular population. So you can see that attitudes toward a particular behavior might vary between non-Hispanic whites, between Hispanics, between Native Americans or African Americans or any other subgroup of interest, right? And so that's what you would have to adjust. It's like we know that attitudes can influence our behavioral intentions to engage in the behavior, but it's like what specific are the attitudes for your specific group that are influencing the behavior, right? And so many of you ask, like, is cultural theory different from, these behavior change theories? Yes, it's a complementary theory to culturally adapt that theory-based, that behavior change theory-based intervention, right? let's see, what else did I want to tell you? Just, have some familiarity for your exam with on these 12 steps. Okay, so these are the dimensions of adaptation identified in the Gastro article. And so they talk about the cognitive informational, the affective motivational, and the environmental dimension of adaptation. And so in the cognitive information, I mean, basically you want to make sure that your target population is understanding the educational material. So, you do have to understand what the reading level is of the target population if you're providing reading materials, or even if it's all oral, you also do have to know, you still have to understand the literacy level, like, will they understand the language that I'm conveying, the particular words that I'm using in my intervention. If you have any kind of health related information or instruction in your intervention, how like the Native American article had information on counting calories, right? And making sure that they were reducing their particular diet by so many calories in order to help promote weight loss. And so, were people able to process that information, and is calculating calories a big thing? Is it too complex a behavior that's just going to result in the person disengaging because either they don't have time for it, or they just don't feel comfortable, or they don't feel like they can do that. Age is a big thing, right? So whether we're working with young or older people, elderly or very young people, or whoever you are, whatever age group of adolescents, the developmental stages influence our ability to comprehend certain information and to assimilate it, right? So, and what kind of repetition is required throughout the intervention. So you do have to pay attention to the developmental stages and even acknowledge the way older people might learn better, right? So to make sure you implement those strategies. And then again, there's the language issue, right? People have to be able to understand the specific language of the intervention. So make sure you are properly translating it for the specific region. The effective motivational component or dimension of adaptation involves all the cultural aspects, right? The beliefs, the norms, the values. You do have to be paying attention to your educational materials and make sure that they are not off-putting to your target population or offensive in any way or against the way people communicate, right? Religion might be another factor that comes into play. So you have to make sure that the program does not cause some kind of reactance in your population such that they either evaluate it as not being for me, like that's for somebody else, I can't even identify with it, or that it's not offensive, right? It's like I'm not like this. It's like I resent the language that's being used in this intervention. And so people might react and not want to participate. Or it doesn't fit within my world. Like, who developed this program? It's like, it doesn't even fit with me or my environment, right? And so that affective, emotional aspect, the cultural aspect is really, really important in the interventions as well. And that's where you need to bring in the community, really. I mean, we can kind of identify the cognitive aspects if you have some knowledge of your population, but the effective motivational is really, that's where the target community, the community stakeholders really play a role in helping develop a good adaptation so that the program's a good fit for the new consumer group. And then finally, the environment is really important, right? And so if a program was developed somewhere and implemented and tested somewhere originally where there's tons of resources for people to either engage in physical activity, or there's an abundance of healthy food, and now you're bringing the program to somewhere that's lacking infrastructure. There's no sidewalks. There's not a lot of parks. They're in a food desert. It's like, imagine how place would affect the delivery of that intervention, or even the ability of that intervention to succeed if the proper environmental resources are not in place. And so social environment is also important here, right? Because they kind of define the norms as to what is acceptable or even popular behavior. So those are things to think about, and these are the dimensions that we focus on when we're adapting a program. They describe two types of adaptation. One is adapting the program content, the way we just talked about with those three dimensions of adaptation. But there's also the adaptation of how you're going to deliver the program. So, what's going to be the medium for delivery? Are you going to deliver it via computer? If it was delivered via the internet or through social media for a certain population, and now you're trying to translate it to this new region and new population that perhaps does not have access to internet, maybe you need to modify the way the program is going to be delivered and get to the people that need it, right? So maybe you decide to do a phone intervention, or you decide to do a face-to-face intervention at community centers, or whatever the case. Oh, sorry, that was the channel. The medium is like who is delivering the intervention, right? It's like, is it going to be someone from the group, someone from the population? Is it going to be delivered through health educators? Is it going to be delivered through promotoras or community health workers? Or is it just going to be delivered via a computer program? The location, if you're delivering that in person, you do have to consider the location of where you're going to be doing these face-to-face interventions. So when we were working with children trying to promote comprehensive sex education, different schools provided us different locations for delivering the intervention. And whereas some schools provided us classrooms where students normally were taught by their teachers, others required us to deliver the intervention in a gym or in a locker room, right? And so those other locations were not as optimal for program delivery. And so the location might have influenced the way we delivered the program. So they talk about these hybrid interventions, kind of designing programs that can be adjusted for different cultural, ethnic groups or special subtypes of groups. And so basically they would have all the important therapeutic and theoretical components, but you would still need to do some homework to adjust the program to the particular type of population. So this really helps to fit a model program, an existing model program, with the targeted culture of the local population. So again, for this type of hybrid interventions and adjusting them to a particular group, you need to engage the community. And so they included this quote at the end of the article because many times researchers come in thinking they can deliver interventions to a particular group without culturally adapting. And I think it's like this realization, right, that, hey, we do need to do more homework before we interact with the population or try to bring any type of model program. So originally, why the community might say, why would we work with you? You can't help us. You don't know how to help us. And the response was, yes, science can help you, but only if we work together. So your assignment this week, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a separate video, but your assignment this week will be to learn as much about your target population for your final project. So as a group, you are going to be, I assigned you homework to go and learn as much about that group, right? Learn about all the social determinants of health that might impact your selected target population. Because you can't go and interact and engage community stakeholders, I'm going to ask you to go and do a literature review, which is the second part of that one assignment, right? Go do a literature review with the target population, even if it's not in your specific region, but if it's a racial ethnic group that other researchers have conducted qualitative interviews or focus groups with to kind of extract how they think about a situation or a behavior or a health outcome. That's the type of information I want you to dig up and incorporate into your report. Okay. So again, you might not have access to the target population you're envisioning for your project, but you have access to all sorts of existing databases that you can go and explore. You have access to the literature, to the scientific literature, where many people have already done a lot of these assessments or interviews in advance. In fact, there's so many studies that focus exclusively on asking people, populations, subpopulations, what their needs are or how they think about it. But then those are not, that information is many times not taken and translated into programs. And so it's there for you to go and explore and to incorporate into your study. Now I'm going to tell you that if you cannot find sufficient information on a particular group or a topic, because you need to not only look at the group, but the group in relationship to the behavior, right, and the overall health problem. You might consider switching topics, right, or adjusting the topic so that to what you can find. And we'll talk about that some more during the assignment description. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about working with diverse populations. Actually, I'm not going to talk about it. I just provide you the slides for it that you can review just so you can get a feel for what are some of the recommendations for working with different racial ethnic groups, given their cultures, their beliefs. So I wanted to give you a little bit of that information. I'm only going to cover some of the demographics up front for each subgroup, and then I'll let you go through the rest of it on your own to explore. And it might be beneficial as you're thinking about your particular subgroup that you're going to work with in your research project, in your final project. So we start with Hispanics. So the Hispanic population, according to the American Community Survey, is the largest minority group in the United States. It used to be African Americans, but recently Hispanics became the largest minority racial ethnic group. So right now there's about 35.3 million Hispanics in the United States. Well, not right now, sorry. Back in 2000, Hispanics made up about 12.5% of the U.S. population. In 2019, it makes up 18.4% of the population. So you can see that there's been a significant increase. And I adjusted the numbers last night, so I don't know that this 43% is correct. But I'll fix it right after the lecture and make sure I put in the correct percentage increase. There's a lot of diversity among Hispanics, especially given the different national origins of Hispanics. So they come from all over the world. A lot of Hispanics come from Latin America, but there's also Puerto Rico and Cuba. Cuba, other nationality origins. What else did I want to tell you about that? Even folks from Spain, I think, are classified under the Hispanic population. So Mexican Americans comprise the largest subgroup of Hispanics. They're the largest. And then second largest are Puerto Ricans, and then Cubans, and then there's a significant, about a quarter of all Hispanics come from Central and South America. And so I'm going to skip all this other stuff that you can examine on your own regarding Hispanics. So you see there's some health beliefs and practices. And so next I want to do a brief presentation on African Americans. And so again, according to the 2019 American Community Survey, the Black or African American population comprises 12.8% of the total U.S. population. 12.4% are non-Hispanic Black. So 12, if you take divide this number and take 12.4 of that, not 12.4 of this, it's just overall 12.4% of the entire U.S. population is non-Hispanic Black, and 0.3% are Hispanic Black. I hope that makes sense. So African Americans or Blacks are mostly concentrated in the southern states. About 53.6% of the Black or African American population is concentrated in the South. Smallest concentration is in the western states. I don't think I list the concentrations for Hispanics in the U.S. in the previous presentation, but I believe they're largely concentrated in the West, the Southwest, okay? West and Southwest in the border states. Let's see. And so there's some cultural competence recommendations, health beliefs and practices. And then we come to the what's culture got to do with it, which was the article assigned to you. I know it's a little bit, it's not as recent as we would like, but I really love this article because it is it's a very rare article in the sense that it really defines how the steps, the process, the actions they took to culturally adapt this program for African American girls, right, for African American adolescents. And so even though there's lots of cultural adaptation frameworks out there, there's not a lot of how-to articles, right? They just kind of give you these general global categories of steps that you need to take. But most people don't know how to do that. And so this one was a really, I thought, excellent example. And so if you find articles like this, where it really teaches you the individual steps and the how to do it, I think they are worth gold, okay? So they define culture and cultural competence. And so you'll see that the definitions of culture vary across different authors, but that's okay. I mean, the general consensus is, that you're taking beliefs, values, just the worldview overall of the individual population into account. Okay, so they wanted to make sure that they were taking into account in their intervention to reduce risk behavior, in particularly substance abuse behavior. They wanted to make sure they were taking all the correct theories and issues that were relevant to guiding behavior in African American girls. And so much of this really focused on increasing ethnic identity and promoting self-esteem of the girls, right? It's like self-love, appreciation of oneself. And so they focused on these different topics. So Afrocentric theory, so making sure we're taking African culture or worldview into account. Promoting ethnic identity of African American girls so that they can be proud, take pride in their ethnic origins. Then gender origins, gender identity is also really important as we are socialized to behave a certain way. and relational theory, which is really important, uh, especially among African American women and girls. Developmental issues also come into play, right? You're working with adolescents, they're going through all sorts of changes. How does that affect the way we think about ourselves? How does that affect the way others treat us? The community context, whether it supports healthy practices or promotes risky behaviors, right? And then the historical considerations. So lots of racial ethnic minority groups have experienced a lot of historical trauma. And so those things need to be taken into consideration because it affects the way we think about ourselves. And how you interpret that history and apply it to yourself is really important. So again, here they wanted, with Afrocentric theory, they wanted to make sure they were incorporating African American culture into the development of the programs for these African American adolescent girls. So because of the long history of African Americans, their beliefs, values, assumptions, the way they view the world has really been influenced by their experiences in Western culture, okay, and especially within the United States. So Afrocentric values, so having a strong sense of one's culture included in these programs helps to promote strong ethnic and racial identity, helps promote positive feelings about the self, promotes good health, positive peer group norms, right? So that what you see around is behavior that is encouraging positive behavior and outcomes. Pro-social behavior, adaptive coping, and academic achievement and health promotion. Okay, so it's important to make sure to, if you're working with African American adolescents, to make sure you take their cultural worldview into account in order to really help foster many of these things, these positive outcomes. Okay, so particular values that they tried to incorporate were spirituality, interpersonal relationships, communalism, expressive communication and orality, and then rhythm and verb. Okay, so for spirituality, what they did is they wanted the girls to consider their spirituality and connect themselves not only to their present, but also to their past to define who they are today, right? So they had these opening and closing ceremonies, or unity circle is what they called it, to promote interpersonal relationships and a sense of communalism. They had the girls engage in cooperative and interdependent learning strategies that included things like team building. Let me catch up in my notes and make sure I'm not missing anything that I want to share with you. Okay. Let's see, expressive communication and orality, and rhythm and verbs. So lots of poetry, lots of music, and hip hop was incorporated into the prevention programs, such that the girls got to experience just listening to, but also writing and performing their own spoken word poetry. And then they incorporated hip hop dance into the closing ceremonies. Again, ethnic identity is really important for you to feel at one with your ethnic origins. And so it provides a sense of belonging to a group, right? And that's important. And it's associated with higher self-esteem. So that someone feels pride in their ethnic group is really important to one's self-esteem. And this helps reduce the likelihood of engaging in self-harm through engagement in risk behaviors or other types of problems behaviors. So how did they address ethnic identity? Well, they made sure to celebrate cultural activities such as Kwanzaa celebrations, which occur around the time of Christmas, and it's a celebration of African American culture and values. Hip hop, they promoted hip hop, which is part of the culture as well, or they incorporated hip hop into their activities. And then they also taught the girls about the culture and history of people who came from African descent. And it really helped to promote the knowledge of one's culture and promote that sense of belonging to something. Again, they tried to promote gender identity and relational theory. And so gender identity, they talk about how African Americans are really socialized. African American girls are socialized kind of in this androgynous gender role that is protective of the girls. So that it incorporates both masculine and feminine traits. And so regarding the masculine traits, they exert a great deal of assertiveness and self-confidence. And also on the feminine side, they are socialized to be nurturing and expressive. So how did they incorporate these into the program? So assertiveness was promoted in a positive way by providing the girls leadership skills and then leadership roles, and then also assisting them in developing good decision-making skills. Expressiveness, again, was through perspective-taking activities, role play, historical experiences that highlight resiliency and overcoming hardships. So somebody talked about how in Native American culture, the storytelling is also a big part of it, and how it tended to resemble this part of promoting or incorporating the expressiveness aspect of the program. Relational orientation, they talk a lot about how the women's identity is kind of based on their interrelational connections. And so part of the program really worked to, but they also talked about how these interpersonal connections might work against the well-being of these girls, especially if they had such loyalty to the relationships that they would follow them into unrisky or unhealthy behaviors, right? Or risky or healthy behaviors. And so that sometimes it could work, this interrelational nature or orientation sometimes worked against the well-being of the girls. So how did they incorporate these characteristics or these issues into the program in a way that would actually benefit? So you can see how you can take something that typically is seen as a negative or that might negatively influence the individual, but take it and convert it to work for the good and well-being of the individual. And so we see that sometimes people struggle with working with different cultural groups, thinking like they are working against their own well-being. It's like, well, let's think about certain characteristics of that population that are seen as a negative and think about how we can convert it so that it actually promotes healthy outcomes. And so how did they incorporate gender identity and relational orientation to the program? So they wanted to help build strong relationships, healthy relationships, right, with other girls and with adult women. And so they incorporated small groups for problem solving and activities to help with that instrumental masculine part of the identity. And then they also work to bring in female elders, right, to model positive behavior and positive relationships with others. And apparently these respected female elders are called, I think I'm saying it right, MCs. Maybe that's not the correct pronunciation, but that's how they were listed. Let's see, the developmental issues affecting African American girls' sense of self were included among those were the biological changes, and this is true for all children, right? For all adolescents are going through these hormonal and reproductive changes. And one issue that they highlighted is that these changes, these biological changes where a girl turns into a woman, tends to occur at earlier ages for African American girls relative to other racial ethnic groups. And so, once you go through that transition, it really affects the way people treat you, whether it be your teachers, your parents, or even your peers, right? As you're going through those changes and becoming more womanly like, it can result in an uncomfortable sense of attention, right, that young girls get. So they talk about how there's also this relational aggression that occurs between, that is socialized among African American girls, which consists of gossiping or ridiculing others in order to assert their dominance over their peers. And so how do you take these two things, right? The awkwardness that comes with those biological changes and how you're supposed to act among your peers. How do we, that relational aggression, how do we convert it into something that will actually benefit the girls? And so they really try to promote collaborative activities, just to help minimize the conformity to behaving a certain way or to dominance by cliques, right? And so they would break out the girls into small groups, and they would put a group leader. They would assign a leadership role, and it kind of helped to break up these cliques. Let's see, the other interesting part, in terms of the developmental nature, is that they tended to group girls that were in the same developmental level of maturity together so that they could talk about issues that were relevant to them at their level of development without them having to kind of have to comply or submit to pressures from people who were more mature among the girls participating in the program. Let's see. And they also provided information to the girls on what was going on in their developmental process, and then also tips for hygiene. So they would bring speakers for skincare, speakers for hair care, and that sort of thing. The community context, again, is really, really important. It can influence the sense of self and relationship to one's society. And then, so place matters. So it matters whether you live in an urban region, overcrowded or low-income urban region, a suburban region, or rural communities. It's going to really affect the culture there, the resources there, the safety of the region. So basically, they highlighted an urban overcrowded community that was experiencing low SES, high crime rates, and didn't have easy access to beneficial organizations or institutions for these girls. And as such, those communities lacked appropriate role models for the girls. And so they talked about how this can result in maladaptive behaviors and support those type of behaviors, and also referred to the bounding process. Whereas if you're born into a certain environment and all that's modeled for you is, poverty, limited job opportunities, lots of crime. If that's what you're born in and that's all you've ever seen, you can't even think to imagine a different world. You can't even think to imagine having the opportunity to exit this world, so that you're bound to that particular uh, society or your community for your life, especially if you don't see people who are successfully moving up or out uh, into better conditions, right? So how did they address this in the program? They brought in role models of different education levels and also of different types of employment to serve as positive role models for the girls. They assisted the girls with goal setting. And you cannot imagine how important goal setting is when working with adolescents, to help them think, to help them envision a different world, right? Or something that they would want for themselves. Goal setting is an important, very important activity when working with youth. And then also providing them the pathway, right, to helping accomplish those goals. So not only did they help them kind of make a plan about their future and maybe their future education, but they also helped them understand what were the financial options to be able to attend college, even if they were low income. Um, and then they also talked about safety precautions for girls. So they asked the girls how they perceived, how safe they felt in their environment. They asked other stakeholders in their community about what the safety issues were in their community. And then they also took objective indicators of safety issues in the communities from where the girls came from. And then took that information and tried to incorporate it in the program to shape the intervention as to how to help the girls stay safe within their environments, within their current environments. And then finally, they considered history of African American populations, African and African American populations in the United States. So they discussed slavery, racism, discrimination, economic disenfranchisement across generations of African Americans, what issues are still pervasive, and then what kind of, especially for African American women. And then also they talked a lot about stereotypes of African American women in the media. And so they're always conveyed as a certain fixed appearance, right? Or they are conveyed as being sexual objects of music or in movies. And so they wanted to help the girls change their perception of these stereotypes so that they did not go into or incorporate that stereotype into how they saw themselves, right? So the way they addressed these was to kind of talk about their preferences for their physical image as an African American women. Talked about diversity in appearance across different African American women. They talked about problem-solving skills and adaptive coping, and just good coping strategies, and not coping strategies that might involve high-risk behaviors, right? They talked about, let's see, skin tone, discrimination against skin tone, so that darker people are discriminated against, and kind of taught them not to do that. And then they also gave them the critical skills to evaluate social media and not accept those images of, especially negative images conveyed in the media of African Americans. Okay. All right, so that was the second article. Let's see. Okay, we're still rolling. I was afraid I had lost you again, or the video had gone out. I'm just going to give you quick demographics of Native Americans. Again, in 2019, African American Indians and Alaska Natives comprise about 0.4% of the U.S. population. So there's 5.7 million American Indians, Alaska Natives in the U.S. There is about 550 federally recognized tribes in the U.S., and they vary dramatically in size. The largest ones being the largest Native American tribes are the Navajo and the Cherokee. And here you see their sizes. And then Alaska Natives, the largest group, the largest subgroup or tribe are Eskimos at 55,000. And so then you can read through all these tips and history. Historical trauma is huge in Native Americans. I want to make sure I'm switching over from African American to Native Americans. And so I'll let you read through these. And so your third reading assignment was the daily article that was focusing on a weight loss program for Native Americans who were overweight or obese. And so basically they try to culturally adapt to take a diabetes prevention program and culturally adapt it for Native Americans. And they use community-based participatory research principles to culturally tailor the 16-week program. So it's 16 sessions across 16 weeks. And they had Native group facilitators who had experience in health education, in health program delivery. And they also conducted weekly in-person group sessions that were conducted at rural or urban community centers, and participants attended, right? Determined where those would be based on their preferences for attending. And then they also got a weekly phone call in between each week. Recruitment occurred by American Indian members, and so recruitment occurred via posters, health fairs, cultural events, even through word of mouth. And so basically in their adaptation, they went through 4 iterations of the program, such that the very first group that they brought in, they would kind of examine how they were doing in the program, give feedback on what was working for them, what was not working for them, what was not culturally relevant to them. And they would take that information and then incorporate it in the next version. So I believe they had originally they planned to have about 8 participants in each group of adaptation. I think they had a little bit more than that. So what would happen is that they kept doing this process across 4 sets of groups. And the types of things that were identified during the adaptation was the importance of cultural events, issues of food insecurity, issues of body image, family dynamics, and how that influenced one's ability to exercise or engage in a healthy diet, and also the contribution of historical trauma to the overall intervention and acknowledgement of that. So each iteration was an improvement of the previous one. So here are the inclusion criteria. And so I kind of wanted to highlight some things, and especially as you're thinking about your own interventions. I think the age range that they targeted was really wide, such that the way you would work with young adults might vary, and how you would work with older adults. So they were working with folks 18 years of age to 70 years of age. And I think that makes it hard to tailor the program appropriately, because we're not only tailoring to one's culture, we're also tailoring to one's developmental stage, right? Or station in life. They had to self-identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. They had to be overweight or obese. They had to be interested in losing weight, so they had to be motivated already, right? They had to be either in the contemplation or the preparation phase to engage in weight loss. They had to have relatively stable weight, so they didn't want anyone who was yo-yoing with excessive weight loss on and off, right? So they couldn't have gained or lost more than 10 pounds in the last 3 months. They had to have a home address with a working phone or cell phone. They had to attend group meetings where that was required. That was where the intervention was provided. And they had to have physician clearance to participate in the program, which involved physical activity. So the study design was a baseline, then they received the intervention, which was 16 weeks, and then they did another assessment at the last session. And so they got $25 to complete those evaluation assessments, which is really important because you want to make sure you're able to collect the data so you can demonstrate, hopefully, what will be positive outcomes. Additional tools that they received in order to carry out the intervention were calorie counter books, pedometers, food scale, and then an educational curriculum that was based on the diabetic program's lifestyle balance curriculum, right? And this is the program that was culturally adapted across those 4 iterations of the intervention delivery. So participants in the program were given the following goal. So they were told to lose 5% of their total body weight. And why 5%? Well, 5% is scientifically proven to have a significant health influence, right? Positive health benefits. So that typically people who lose 5% of their total body weight may see improvements in things like insulin production, cholesterol levels, their blood pressure, and other health indicators. Okay, so that's always, at least when people are really struggling, that's an initial target of total body weight loss. They wanted these folks to try to increase their physical activity to 225 minutes per week of moderate physical activity. Okay, so they said this typically consisted of walking. And so, again, given the different age groups, given weather, given a variety of factors that might influence a person's ability to engage in walking, right, is something to think about when doing this intervention. How feasible was it for these folks to engage in this type of activity through walking in their communities? They had to keep a weekly food log following a diet that was reduced by 300 to 1,000 kilocalories below their maintenance requirements. So they had to learn how to count calories, right? How to track their calories. And so again, thinking about the health literacy of the population was this properly vetted to make sure that this was something that they could do or even understand or want to engage in. They had to eat 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables servings per day. And so when people are experiencing food insecurity and when they live in food deserts, how feasible is it for them to access this type of food, and is it within their financial capability? And so I don't recall seeing this. Let's see. The program, so what did they learn from this program? Well, that it was effective in reducing weight for participants completing the program. So they talk about, how 70-something actually enrolled in the program, but really only about, what was it? How many? I think they were left with 34 people who actually completed the program. And so really that's what they should be using to examine the impact of the program. Um, because they lost over half of the people that enrolled, and about 10 of those dropped out before even the first official session started, and the rest of them dropped out like in the first 5 sessions. And so again, it was a 16 session program, and they lost over half very early on. And so what was it about this program that was not working for a good chunk of the participants, right? Like what perhaps they needed to continue culturally adapting this program. But those who did stay in, about 76% did manage to lose weight, somewhere between 3 to 7%. I think the majority of those were reported to having lost 3% of their body weight. So they were well underway to meeting that 5% weight loss. Um, but why? Again, why did they lose so many participants and so early on, right? What were the characteristics of the people who dropped out? What were the remaining areas of mismatch? So that's something for you to explore. You can go back to perhaps to the Castro article and look at all those areas of mismatch, of potential areas of mismatch, and say, how did this intervention not fit the needs, the environment, the culture, the cognitive ability of the population there? How might it have not met that, even though you're not there to assess it carefully? Okay. All right, so just a really quick review of for Asian Pacific Islanders. So this is your target group for your intervention. So according to the American Community Survey in 2019, Asian Pacific Islanders comprised about 5.7% of the total U.S. population. So again, lots of diversity among Asian Pacific Islanders. So they're all grouped together for census purposes, but it's ridiculous because the subgroups are so different, not only in terms of origin, but also in terms of health outcomes. And so also lots of diverse cultures in the Asian Pacific Islanders. So the largest, well, not Asian Indian, Chinese is the largest Asian Pacific Islander subgroup or sub-ethnic Asian group at 23.6%, followed by Asian Indian Americans. Okay, so folks originating from India. So those are very, very rapidly growing populations in the United States. And I think that Asian Indians are going to exceed the population of Chinese, or at least they're projected to in coming years. Filipinos are third, and then Vietnamese, and then Korean. Japanese are the smallest of the Asian subgroups. Among the Pacific Islanders, there's about somewhat shortly in excess of 25 groups. Native Hawaiians are the largest. Then Samoans, then the Chamorro and Guameans, and then other Pacific Islander subgroups. And so then you can read through the information I provided for you. Okay, because I had a lot of information. And I didn't want to leave the discussion about the different racial ethnic groups. I mean, we've been talking about racial ethnic minority groups, but we also have to take the white population into account as a racial ethnic group. So according to 2019's American Community Survey, the white population is by far the largest group in the United States. They account for 72% of the U.S. population. Of the white population, 60% of the total U.S. population is non-Hispanic white. So still the largest racial ethnic minority. I mean, not minority, but the group. Again, lots of diversity within this white population, different national origins. We always attribute American culture to the white population as being very individualistic. But is there diversity in culture across white populations, across white subgroups? And you should know that there is, right? There is. What we need to culturally adapt a program that was developed for a non-Hispanic white population in Seattle. And when you're taking that program and trying to apply it to a white population in Appalachia, would that require some kind of cultural adaptation? And I would argue that it would. And I would argue that you should go, and engage the community, the Appalachian community that you're working with, to understand their culture and their unique needs and their environment, to see how it might contribute to the implementation of this, to the adaptation and then the implementation of the intervention. Okay. Okay, so that's it for today. So I will record a short lecture in a bit about your assignment. But again, your job will be to go and find out as much as possible, to have an understanding of that population that you want to work with, right? So not only their racial ethnic composition, but also their developmental stage is going to be important. The place in particular where they're living is something that you'll want to know about, whether it's rural, urban, suburban, or other, right? And all the other factors that might affect or influence health behavior and health outcomes, right? And so, so more to come on that. And I'll see you in a little bit. Okay.